Hola, ¿cómo estás? Llamo-me Linje Manyozo, sou professor da Universidade de RMIT in Melbourne, Australia. I am a communication for development scholar and practitioner, and my work has revolved around understanding, studying, and capturing citizen voices so that they are articulated properly and authentically within dominant and orthodox development policy formulation and implementation. In other words, my work, my scholarship, and my practice is all about celebrating people, making love to people, making love to the world. I know that we are celebrating the works and life of Paulo Freire. I would like to share some thoughts, some ideas, and some conceptual formulations with regards to what I think Freire stood for. I think it is important to remind ourselves and each other as to what Freire stood for, because of late, especially in the last 20 and 30 years, I have seen a number of organizations, institutions, and corporations, especially within the development industry, who have appropriated the works of Freire and are going about claiming that their work is rooted in the dialogical method of Freire. Yet, the direction and impact of their policies has nothing to do with Freire. In fact, it has something to do with further perpetuation of colonial attitudes, mentalities, and practices in terms of addressing underdevelopment and poverty. I don't claim to be an expert on Freire. I am a student of his works. I'm a student of society, and I'm sure most of you are. So what are the critical issues? What are the critical elements that we should remind ourselves when we discuss the work of Freire? I have about 5 here that I'm going to share with you, and I'm sure the ensuing conversations are going to build on this and talk about further lessons and learnings from his life and works. The first critical element in the work of Paulo Freire, based on my own experiences as a teacher and as a practitioner, concerns the role of transformative education in uprooting the root causes of colonization and imperialism. I think we do agree that however we interpret Freire, the essence of his work, the essence of his practice, the essence of his epistemology and pedagogy lay in building a coalition of oppressed groups, building their consciousness so that they are empowered enough to uproot colonization. In other words, Freire's methods, approaches, and practices were anti-colonial, were very humanist. Freire's work was about establishing, experimenting with the project of humanism. To put it more bluntly, there is no humane form of colonization, and therefore there is no any other way we can describe, we can explain, we can make sense of Paulo Freire's work within the framework of colonization. Freire's life was dedicated to uprooting colonization and its after effects. And in the case of the global South, especially in the case of Latin America and of course Brazil, Freire was concerned with the rising inequality. He was concerned with the rising poverty, the rising cases of violence, violence against women, violence against children, violence against minorities. He was concerned with that. And he knew that in many, many cases, such kind of challenges were as a result, direct result of colonization, especially settler colonization. And even after the end of settler colonization, internal colonization had continued to duplicate the methods and systems and institutions of violence that had been perpetrated by the former colonizers. So the basis of Freire's work, for anybody reading Freire's work, is that his work, then as well as now, has always been anti-colonialist. His pedagogy was all about uprooting colonization and its after effect. The second critical factor in the work of Paulo Freire is very similar to the first one, revolves around the notion of the transformative educator. Antonio Gramsci would probably, in the prison notebooks, describe this transformative educator as an organic intellectual. Organic intellectual in that they are cultivated by the class from which they come from. Freire's letters to Christina discusses an experience in childhood when they were experiencing poverty. Their family were experiencing poverty. They were experiencing absolute poverty, lack of food and famine. And there was a time they saw, him and his brother saw a chicken, the neighbor's chicken, walking around in their yard. They grabbed it and killed it. And of course, in the evening, his mother cooked it and they ate in silence. But he would describe this experience years later when he became a very important man, responsible for formulating policies, educational policies in his state in Brazil, when he said, I understood what poverty meant. I understood what it meant to go to school on an empty stomach. And I knew that every time I would form policies, I would have these kids at the back of my mind. So in other ways, this traditional intellectual, this organic intellectual, this revolutionary educator, the transformative teacher, does not just emerge from nowhere. He is cultivated by a specific class, oppressed class from which he comes. But is Freire saying that we cannot have radical and transformative educators who come from probably privileged backgrounds? I don't think so. Perhaps the answer can be found in the introduction that Edward Said writes to Orientalism, the new introduction, the new revised introduction written in the aftermath of September 11, 2001 attacks in New York City. He writes that we have the moral imperative, we have the political, the moral duty to study other people, not necessarily to exert our own superiority over them, but to improve our understanding of other people and places and their cultures. So even if somebody is born from outside the context of oppression and subalternity, they do, as long as they're able to learn, to humble themselves and learn about a particular class experience and appreciate that, then they are able to work with an oppressed group in their revolutionary struggle to transform their own society. What is essential is that a transformative educator, this organic intellectual, must have deep passion, must have deep respect for the people they are working with. There is no two ways about it. You have to have deep respect and passion for the people. Which brings us to a third factor in Freire's work, and that is dialogical communication. In this beautiful book, We Make the Road by Walking, which was like a spoken book with this American educationist, Miles Horton, Freire talks about himself. He says, I'm a man of radio and television. But he doesn't claim to be an expert. What he's trying to do is to explain the importance of communication in his praxis. The whole concept of dialogical communication is given adequate consideration in chapter 3 in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he describes dialogical communication, dialogue, not just as content, not just as process, but as an institution that should be established and sustained over a long period of time to enable marginalized groups to contribute sustainably to ongoing discourses and discussions about the future and nature of their own society. So it's no longer just a question of establishing focus group discussions. It's not just a question of doing interviews or people talk about participatory consultations. That's not it's not just about that. It's about having mechanisms in place within our governance systems that allow for subaltern groups to speak and be heard. To such an extent, if we were to ask the question by Gayatri Spivak, can the subaltern speak? The answer should be a definite yes. But that can only happen if the mechanisms are there to open up conversations for groups, for oppressed groups, especially those that don't have access to lines of social mobility. So dialogue is a necessary component of a revolutionary educational praxis. We know from reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed that Paulo Freire gave a lot of adequate consideration to the works of Frantz Fanon, especially The Wretched of the Earth. But we also know that if he had had time at that time to read another of Fanon's books, that is A Dying Colonialism, he would have read a chapter there, a chapter that talks about the voice of free Algeria. This is a chapter in which Fanon discusses the revolutionary practices by broadcasters belonging to the rebel soldiers during the Algerian fight for independence, which involved interrupting French broadcasting signals from Paris and broadcasting their own news and content that aimed to empower people, to give them a new revolutionary spirit and direction. So even if we are talking about media and communication policy, we are not just talking about opportunities for people to speak up, like having community radios. That's not sufficient enough. We are talking about enabling policy to ensure that the orientation, the philosophical orientation of our media and communication systems are driven towards establishing a society that is more equal, more just, and more democratic, which raises a concern, especially because nowadays in our modern democracies, a lot of our institutions have been privatized by the state has been privatized itself. To an extent, it has been captured by private interests. So we might think that there is a lot of liberalism in the media and communication industry and the telecom industry. But we find that a few politically connected individuals and institutions are the ones who have ownership and control of our media and communications policies, institutions, and platforms. So these have no interest at all in terms of liberating oppressed groups. They're there to serve their own bourgeoisie interests. A fourth factor that we can also not forget, which is very critical and emerges from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, whose theme is carried over into Letters to Christina, is the notion of empathy. For Freire, empathy is not just about putting forward proposals to execute a charity intervention. It's not just about charity. Empathy for Paulo Freire is a facility for understanding and embracing oppressed groups. To be empathetic is to establish political solidarity. To emphasize this, because Paulo Freire's work were also informed by liberatory theology. We go back to Father Gustavo Gutierrez, who writes in A Theology of Liberation, describing the preferential option for the poor, where the church, not just as an institution, but as a collective of individuals, God-fearing individuals, the church deliberately undertakes the vow to take Jesus back into the community, to talk about Jesus as not just the Son of God, but as the Son of God who is really interested in redeeming people from both their spiritual as well as material poverty. In fact, when I'm reading Freire's works, it takes me back to the Sermon on the Mount, where we read about the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's written there. So this empathy, this solidarity, is one that is described in Matthew 5, where the transformative educator deliberately undertakes the vow, undertakes the initiative to position themselves in relation to oppressed groups of people. Which brings us to point number 5, which I think is very critical, because it's prevalent in all of Freire's work. And that is the critical aspect of Freire as a Christian. There has always been a misconception that when one is Marxist, then they are anti-God, anti-Christian. But we see from some of Freire's interviews on YouTube and other online facilities that for him there is no dichotomy at all. It's not a dichotomous relationship. It's not an antagonistic relationship. It's like the same continuum that whose pendulum swings between Marxism and Christianity. When he initially went out to work with poor communities, Freire was actually expressing his faith in God, the gratuitous love of God, as a pastoral vocation. And it is there that he begins to learn about Marx, that the ideals he had believed in at a spiritual level, the ideals of hungering and thirsting for righteousness, are the ones that Marx expresses in various publications of his. The idea that inequality can be uprooted, the idea that the means of production can be owned by the workers. And I like this thought a lot, because nowadays in the academy, wherever we are working, whether it's in development practice, the mere mention of God, sometimes raises eyebrows. It's like you have mentioned something that is not supposed to be mentioned. But I always ask people who claim to practice, to implement Freire's works, how can you claim to practice Freirean principles when you disavow the Christian, the godly foundation of his works? I see no difference between the Sermon on the Mount and Freire's works with regards to participation, to dialogue, to liberation. It's about rescuing the opportunities and making them available for people who have always been marginalized, who have been left behind by capitalism, globalization, and imperialism. Now, friends, I don't seek to claim to be an expert, as I said, but I thought it is imperative that we share some ideals, some thoughts with regards to the work of Freire. Because there is often a tendency to forget what actually happened and remember things that did not happen. That's what George Orwell talks about in Animal Farm. And as we celebrate Freire, let us celebrate his works in its truthfulness, in its entirety, not subtracting, not adding things that were not there. Yes, we are going to adapt, considering that the times are changing. But they are central pieces of his works, central pieces of his thoughts, his ideals, issues to do with dialogue, to do with transformation, to do with liberation, to do with empathy, love, humility, to do with God, to do with Jesus, to do with anti-colonization, and to do with humanism. That cannot be discarded, cannot be appropriated and edited out of his works. I want to wish you well in your discussions, and I'm sure that at a certain point our paths are going to cross. Let us continue these conversations now and forever. Thank you. Obrigado. Diabulera.